When I saw my husband standing in the hallway, holding the small silver brooch between his fingers, my stomach twisted into something tight and cold. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at it, then at me, and back again, like trying to solve a puzzle he didn't know existed. I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat dried up. That brooch had never been meant to come home. I had left it deliberately, thought I'd buried it in that motel room, along with everything that happened between those four walls. But now, it was here. In his hands. In our house. In our silence. He finally said, "You wore this last month, didn't you?" I nodded, barely. My pulse screamed in my ears. "But I found it in the glove compartment," he added. "Of your car." My knees almost buckled. I tried to say something, anything, an excuse, a joke, a lie, but I couldn't. Because that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was that for a brief, shameful second, I felt relief. Relief that he'd found the brooch instead of something else. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. One that slipped quietly through the cracks of my ordinary life and bloomed into something much bigger. And now it's time I tell you everything. Everything I tried to bury beneath errands and smiles and long evening silences. But before I begin, let me ask you, have you ever kept a secret so heavy you could feel it breathing behind your ribs every single day? My life has always had structure. Routines. Predictability. Mornings began with the sound of the kettle, evenings ended with quiet television and lukewarm tea. My husband and I had been married for over 2 decades, and by most standards, we had done well. A house in a quiet suburb. A working heater. A shared checking account. No scandals, no real fights. Just the slow settling of time into the crevices of our marriage. But lately, I'd begun to feel like wallpaper. Present, consistent, but unnoticed. Not because he didn't love me, I know he does, in his way. But he had stopped seeing me. And I had stopped trying to be seen. Until that day in the kitchen, when he mentioned his nephew was back in town. He had said it so casually, pouring coffee into his chipped mug. "You remember my sister's boy? He's working with antiques now. Has a shop near the train station. Wants to redo the showroom. I told him you have good taste." I didn't respond right away. My mind had been elsewhere, already churning through the errands of the day. But then he added, "You should go meet him. Help him pick out some pieces. Give you something to do." Something to do, I smiled, politely. That wasn't meant to sting, but it did. And maybe that was the moment the first crack appeared. Later that week, I drove downtown. The antique shop was tucked between a dry cleaner and a bookstore, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. The windows were dusty, and the sign hung slightly crooked. Inside, the air smelled of varnish and age, like time had settled itself into the floorboards. He stood behind the counter, leaning over a catalog. When he looked up, I recognized him immediately, though he had changed. Taller, broader, more sculpted at the jaw than the awkward teen I remembered. His smile was easy. Familiar. And when he said my name, I heard something in his voice I couldn't quite place. We talked for a while, about the shop, about his move, about furniture and history and what kind of light bulbs best complemented mahogany. He listened intently. Looked me in the eye when I spoke. Not in that distant, half their way my husband had adopted in recent years. But fully. Entirely. It wasn't attraction. Not yet. But something stirred. Something long dormant. Over the next week, I returned twice. Once to drop off fabric samples. Another time just to pass by and bring him coffee. Each time, our conversations deepened. He asked about my tastes, my hobbies, what I did before I was a wife. The last question stopped me cold. What did I do before? I laughed it off. I used to be someone who wore heels to the grocery store, I said. He looked at my flats. You still could. Something in my chest shifted. A tight knot loosening. At home, I began noticing things. The way my husband reached for the remote the moment dinner was over. How he kissed my cheek with the precision of a habit. How he didn't notice I'd changed my perfume. I wasn't angry with him. I was just eroding. One afternoon, as I folded laundry, I found myself holding one of his shirts to my face. Not his, the nephew's. I must have taken it home accidentally after one of our visits. He had asked me to look through a bin of old textiles in the back room. I'd carried a few samples in my bag. Somehow, this shirt ended up in the mix. It smelled faintly of cologne. Not the sharp, expensive kind. Something simpler. Earthy. I pressed the fabric against my cheek, then quickly dropped it, ashamed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark living room, sipping wine, watching the ice melt in the glass. When my husband walked in, half asleep, he mumbled, "Everything okay?" I nodded. Just thinking. He kissed my forehead and went back to bed. I stayed awake another hour. The next morning, I returned the shirt to the shop. Told the nephew I'd accidentally taken it. He laughed, a little too long. I felt flushed. I wondered where it went, he said. Thought maybe I imagined wearing it last week. I should have left then. But I lingered. He showed me a collection of brooches he'd found at an estate sale. I held one up to the light, a small silver piece with filigree edges. Dainty. Feminine. It reminded me of something my grandmother might have worn. He took it from me gently, then reached to pin it to my blouse. His fingers brushed my collarbone. I didn't move. There, he said softly. You look like someone who belongs in another era. My throat felt dry. I stepped back, murmured thanks, and left before the air between us could change again. But it already had. At home, I placed the brooch on my vanity. Not hidden, but not displayed either. Somewhere in between. Like me. That night, I cooked dinner as usual. Chicken, roasted vegetables, nothing special. My husband complimented the seasoning. I smiled. He asked if I'd seen his nephew recently. I lied. No. Not in a few days. That was the first lie. Small. Almost invisible. But it planted something. And once something is planted, it finds a way to grow. Even in the most carefully tended gardens. Even in marriages like mine. The morning after I lied to my husband, everything felt heavier. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like it was trying to smother the weight of something unspoken. I moved through the rooms like a guest in someone else's home, my fingers brushing across the backs of chairs and the edges of picture frames, searching for grounding. I busied myself with errands that didn't need to be run. Grocery store. Post office. Dry cleaner. I parked far from each entrance, walked slowly, hoping the rhythm of my steps would organize my thoughts. It didn't. The further I walked, the more my mind returned to that moment in the antique shop, his fingers fastening the brooch to my blouse, the near imperceptible pause before he stepped back. The warmth of his hand stayed with me longer than it should have. Later that day, I found myself driving toward the shop again. I didn't plan it. I told myself I was just passing by, that I needed to check if he'd found those brass drawer handles we talked about. But the moment I pulled into the parking spot across the street, I knew I was lying to myself again. He was standing outside, speaking with an older man holding a clipboard. His posture was relaxed, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing toward the storefront. I didn't get out of the car. I watched from behind the tinted glass, like a stranger observing lives that had nothing to do with me. But they did. At least, I wanted them to. After a few minutes, he looked toward the street. I didn't know if he saw me, but something in his expression shifted. He excused himself and began walking in my direction. I panicked. Started the car. Pulled out of the space before he reached the sidewalk. My heart raced the entire drive home, and when I arrived, I sat in the garage with the engine off, hands gripping the wheel until the tension in my fingers ached. That evening, I cooked again. Something simple. I noticed my husband watching me more than usual. Not suspiciously, more like he was remembering something he hadn't thought of in a while. At dinner, he said the food was excellent and asked if I had thought about taking a cooking class. I forced a smile, unsure whether it was a suggestion or an attempt to re-engage me. I said I'd think about it. But I wouldn't. I didn't want to be distracted from the very thing I knew I should be forgetting. The next day, the nephew sent me a message. Just a few words. You left something. That was it. No context. I stared at the screen, rereading it, trying to decide whether to respond. Eventually, I typed back, "What did I leave?" He replied, "Time. Come take it back." I told myself not to go. Told myself to delete the messages and return to being the woman who always knew the right thing to do. But I was no longer sure who that woman was. So, I went. This time, when I entered the shop, the atmosphere felt different. Not because anything had changed, the shelves still leaned slightly, the air still carried that sweet trace of old polish and faded paper, but because I had changed. Or maybe just stopped pretending I hadn't. He was at the counter, sorting through a box of old postcards. When he saw me, his face didn't light up, didn't change dramatically. He simply said, "I was starting to think you wouldn't come." I almost didn't, I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He held up one of the postcards. People used to send these instead of messages. They'd write something small and send it across the country. And then they'd wait. Imagine that. Writing something this short, then waiting 2 weeks for a response. I walked closer, looking at the card in his hand. It was yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. Someone had written, "Wish you had been here, but maybe it's better you weren't." He smiled faintly. There's always something underneath the words. We didn't speak about the brooch. Or the look we shared that day. Instead, he walked me to the back of the shop, where he had arranged a collection of items for a potential display, a set of vintage perfume bottles, lace gloves, a silver hand mirror, and a pair of Art Deco earrings. "Which piece do you think belongs in the center?" he asked. I reached for the mirror. "This." He nodded. "Why?" "Because it forces you to see yourself." He studied my face for a moment. "And do you like what you see?" I hesitated. Then said, "Sometimes." He didn't press further. Just walked around the display and adjusted the lighting. "I need someone to help me with this kind of stuff. I mean it. You have a good eye. And you know how things should feel." I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. "That's kind of you." "I'm not being kind," he said plainly. "I'm being honest." He moved closer then. Not abruptly. Not with force. But with a slow, deliberate calm that made my breath catch. For a moment, we just stood there, the air between us thick and charged. And then, we kissed. We kissed. It was not dramatic. It was not desperate. It was deliberate. A moment suspended, carried by something that had been building in silence for days. Maybe weeks. When we stepped back, neither of us spoke. I grabbed my purse, muttered something about having to go, and walked out into the brightness of the afternoon sun. The walk to my car felt longer than usual. My legs were steady, but my heart wasn't. I sat in the driver's seat with the door open, staring at the sidewalk, listening to the sound of distant traffic and the flutter of my heartbeat. At home, I undressed slowly. Not because I was tired, but because every movement felt loaded. I hung my blouse in the back of the closet, away from my others. Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't want to look at it. Not yet. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the shadows move across the ceiling, felt my husband shift beside me, his breathing soft and even. I wanted to reach out to him. Say something honest. Something raw. But I didn't. Because I wasn't sure which truth to tell. What happened wasn't planned. It wasn't part of some grand unraveling. It was just one moment. One choice. But I could already feel its consequences moving like ripples in a quiet pond. And I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The days that followed were heavy with silence, not the absence of sound, but the kind that builds in corners of rooms, under dinner plates, between the clinking of cutlery. My husband and I moved around each other gently, like dancers with forgotten steps. He wasn't suspicious. He wasn't even distant. If anything, he seemed slightly more attentive. He asked if I wanted tea more often, offered to run small errands without being prompted. His kindness unsettled me. Not because it was new, but because I knew I didn't deserve it anymore. I found myself avoiding mirrors. Not out of shame, necessarily, but because I no longer recognized the woman reflected back. She was softer in places that had once been firm. Her eyes were lined, yes, but it wasn't aging that made her unfamiliar, it was the knowledge she now carried. I tried to anchor myself in routine, laundry folded, groceries stocked, floors cleaned with quiet precision. But nothing settled the swirl inside me. And then he texted. No words this time. Just a photo, an antique photo frame shaped like a miniature oval mirror. Gilded edges. Empty in the middle. No caption. No explanation. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether it was an invitation, a memory, or a provocation. But I didn't ask. That afternoon, I told my husband I was going out to pick up light bulbs for the hallway fixture. It was a half-truth, the light bulb was, in fact, out. But I had no intention of going to the store. I drove the long way to the shop. Not because I didn't know the route, but because I needed time. Time to feel something solid, to decide if I'd imagined the charge between us. I didn't listen to music. I let the low hum of the car fill the space around me like a fog. When I arrived, he was sitting on the floor behind the counter, sorting through a stack of aged newspapers. He looked up and smiled in that quiet, nonchalant way that felt too natural. Like I was just someone who dropped in often. Like I hadn't run out the door the last time, heart pounding like a drum. You came, he said, not rising. I needed air, I answered. He nodded. This place has plenty of it. We didn't mention the kiss. We didn't talk about what it meant. He simply pushed a cardboard box toward me. Help me sort these? I found some old advertisements. Might be worth framing. I knelt down beside him. The box was filled with wrinkled paper, brittle at the edges, smelling faintly of mildew and ink. We worked in silence for a while, our arms brushing occasionally. Each touch was small, insignificant on the surface, but underneath, there was current. A low-voltage hum between us that neither of us acknowledged. At one point, I found a folded envelope, yellowed and sealed with wax. No name. No address. Just a crest I didn't recognize. I held it out to him. He studied it, then smiled. I like things that don't tell you everything up front. I turned it over again, feeling the texture of the paper. Maybe some things aren't meant to be opened. Maybe some things beg to be, he replied. I should have left then. That was the moment. I felt it. A part of me screamed to stand, to walk away while the door was still near and the air still breathable. But I didn't. I stayed. He asked if I wanted coffee. I nodded. He disappeared into the back room, and I stood slowly, stretching my legs. I wandered through the aisles, letting my fingers trail over the edges of items I couldn't name. Old lamps, cracked porcelain, lace doilies folded too neatly. Each item had belonged to someone once. Carried meaning. And now they just waited. Like I was waiting. When he returned, he handed me the cup and leaned against the counter. You always carry your keys in your left pocket. I blinked. How do you know that? You fiddle with them when you're thinking. I looked down, instinctively reaching to that pocket. Sure enough, the weight was there. I hadn't realized I did that. I didn't know how to feel about the fact that he had. You notice a lot, I said, keeping my eyes on the rim of the cup. I do. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth distract me. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. By the time I left, the sky had begun to darken. It wasn't late, but the clouds were thick, and a chill had crept into the wind. I sat in my car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, unsure what I was waiting for. When I got home, my husband was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with slow, rhythmic precision. He looked up when I entered. Did you find the right bulbs? I nodded, though I hadn't bought any. He smiled. Good. I'll fix the fixture tomorrow. He returned to the cutting board without another word. I watched his back for a long moment, unsure if I wanted him to turn around or not. That night, we sat on the couch together, watching something neither of us paid much attention to. He reached for my hand at one point, and I let him hold it. His fingers were warm, familiar, steady. I closed my eyes, pretending for a second that nothing had changed. That I was still the woman who could meet his touch with complete openness. But I wasn't. In bed, I lay awake long after he fell asleep. I watched the ceiling again. Counted the slow shadows as headlights from passing cars swept across the walls. My thoughts were quieter now, but heavier. Less frantic, more deliberate. I wasn't sure what was happening between the nephew and me. I didn't have language for it. It wasn't love. It wasn't even lust. It was like finding an old photograph of yourself and realizing you used to look at the world differently. It was memory and discovery wrapped into one. It was dangerous. And yet, I knew I would see him again. Not because I had to. But because a part of me already belonged in that dusty shop, among the forgotten things, waiting to be found again. The morning after my last visit to the shop, I stood in the bathroom longer than usual, letting the water from the shower turn my skin pink. I didn't want to get out. There was something about the sound of it, steady and loud, that drowned out the buzzing in my thoughts. But eventually, I did. Wrapped myself in a towel, stepped into the foggy mirror's reflection, and tried to find the version of myself that wasn't unraveling. My husband had already left for work. His plate was in the sink, eggs half-eaten, coffee mug rinsed and placed upside down on the drying rack. A note by the toaster read, "Pick a night this week. Let's do something different." He'd drawn a little smiley face at the end, the kind he always used when he didn't want to sound too formal. I folded the note and slipped it into the side drawer of the kitchen island, pretending it wasn't there. Not yet. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I tried to clean the guest bedroom but stopped halfway through making the bed. I moved laundry from one basket to another without sorting. I opened the fridge 3 times and never took anything out. By late afternoon, I was sitting on the back patio, nursing a glass of lemonade and watching the wind play with the edges of the tablecloth. That's when he called. Not a message. Not a photo. Just the quiet hum of my phone and his name on the screen. I let it ring once. Twice. 3 times before answering. I have something I want to show you, he said. No greeting. No explanation. His voice was low, steady. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the glass in my hand, the condensation slipping over my fingers. Not there, he added. Somewhere else. I knew I should say no. Knew I should hang up and let this entire thing fade into memory. But instead, I said, where? He gave me the name of a location I barely recognized. And estate sale. A town just outside the city. I told him I'd think about it. Then I hung up, not giving him a yes, but not giving him a no either. That night, over dinner, my husband mentioned the same estate sale. I saw a flyer at the hardware store. Some collector's home. Want to go together? My fork paused halfway to my mouth. I smiled, careful. Maybe. Sounds like a long drive. He shrugged. Could be fun. We haven't done something like that in ages. I nodded. Changed the subject. The next morning, I told him I had errands. That I needed to return a dress that didn't fit, maybe swing by the garden center. He kissed me on the cheek, said to call if I needed anything. Then he left. I drove with the windows down, the cool air tugging at my sleeves. I rehearsed excuses in my head, little lies that sounded harmless. They weren't malicious, I told myself. Just necessary. Temporary. The kind of lies people used to keep the peace. But the pit in my stomach said otherwise. The house was enormous. A sprawling old property with cracked columns and a driveway lined with bare trees. People wandered the front lawn holding clipboards, peering into boxes and crates. I found him near the porch steps, holding a leather-bound journal, his fingers running along the spine. He looked up as I approached. You came. I wasn't sure I would. I was. He led me through the side of the house, where the less public items were stored. Furniture stacked behind velvet ropes. Oil paintings leaned against faded wallpaper. Every room smelled of dust and forgotten stories. We didn't talk much. He showed me a dressing table with a cracked mirror, asked what I thought. I said it had character. He laughed softly and said, "So do you." I rolled my eyes, but my lips curled despite myself. At some point, he reached for a pair of gloves on a side table, delicate lace, yellowed with time. He handed one to me. Try it. I slipped it over my hand. The fabric was thin, nearly transparent, like something from a different life. He studied my fingers, then said, "Fits perfectly." I looked at him. You always do this. What? Collect things that don't belong to you? He tilted his head. Maybe I'm just giving them somewhere to be seen. The weight of that landed harder than it should have. I turned away, eyes scanning the room, trying to ground myself in objects instead of feeling. We parted outside the house. He didn't ask me to stay. I didn't linger. The ride home felt longer than it was, the landscape blurring into a soft, muted smear of green and gray. When I got back, my husband was in the garage, sanding an old side table. He looked up, smiled through the dust on his face. How was your day? I hesitated, then said, uneventful. He nodded. We should go somewhere next weekend. Just us. Drive up to the lake, maybe. I smiled again. Sure. That sounds nice. Inside, I changed clothes, folded the gloves into the back of my dresser, and sat on the edge of the bed. My fingers still remembered the texture of them, the way they hugged each joint. The brooch, the gloves, the journal, all pieces of a story I hadn't meant to start. And yet, they were now part of mine. I wasn't collecting objects. I was collecting moments. Ones I couldn't explain, couldn't categorize, but couldn't stop chasing. That night, I lay in bed listening to the soft rhythm of my husband's breathing. I watched the light shift on the ceiling, traced the patterns in my mind. This wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't even an affair. Not yet. It was proximity. Exposure. Quiet gravity. And I was moving closer to something I couldn't name. Or maybe, something I'd been trying to remember. The days blurred again after the estate visit, but this time the rhythm was different. I found myself moving more slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Every moment had a weight now. Pouring coffee. Folding towels. Answering simple questions from my husband like, "Did you see the mail?" or "What time is your appointment?" All of it felt suspended above a line I had not yet crossed, or had I? I tried to act like everything was the same. I took longer walks, watered the garden more carefully, even pulled out old recipe cards I hadn't looked at in years. I baked muffins one afternoon, set them on the counter, then stared at them for nearly an hour without touching a single one. My husband noticed. "You're nesting," he said, smiling. "What are we preparing for?" I shook my head, brushing flour from my fingers. "Just trying to bring some life back in." He nodded, touched my waist briefly in passing, then reached for one of the muffins. His touch stayed with me long after he left the kitchen. Later that day, I received another message. Today was long. Come help me forget time. I stared at the screen for several minutes. I didn't answer. But I didn't delete it either. That evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I opened my closet and stood there without purpose. My eyes scanned hangers I'd ignored for years. Blouses I hadn't worn since holiday dinners. Dresses that felt too bright. Too fitted. Too hopeful. I reached for one I hadn't seen in months, soft navy fabric, buttons down the front, just enough structure to hold shape without being stiff. I didn't put it on. I just held it up to the light, watched how it moved when I turned slightly. Then I folded it gently and set it on the chair. The next morning, I wore it. I told my husband I was meeting a friend for lunch. He offered to drive me, but I declined. I said I needed time alone after. That I might stop by the market or the bookstore. He accepted it without suspicion. He kissed my forehead before leaving. "You look lovely," he said. And then he was gone. When I arrived at the shop, he was outside, pacing slowly with a rolled-up poster under his arm. He stopped when he saw me, his expression unreadable. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said. I didn't either. We didn't go inside right away. Instead, he gestured toward the car parked along the curb, a vintage model I hadn't seen before, not the one he usually drove. It was cream-colored with red leather seats, polished but not flashy. "I borrowed it," he said. "Felt like we needed a different backdrop today." I hesitated before getting in. The seat was low, the leather cool beneath my legs. He started the engine, and the soft hum of it filled the silence. We didn't speak for several minutes as he pulled onto the road, taking a direction I didn't recognize. The drive was long and quiet, but not uncomfortable. The windows were down, the breeze soft, and the radio played faint old jazz that reminded me of hotel lounges and Sunday evenings from childhood. I watched the trees blur by, the shifting light on the dashboard, the way his hand rested casually on the gearshift. Eventually, we reached a hill just outside town, one of those places people drive past but never stop. There was a view overlooking the distant rooftops, broken only by a stretch of trees and a field that had long since turned to dust. He parked and got out. I followed. The air was clearer here, untouched by exhaust or city noise. He laid the poster on the hood of the car, unrolled it carefully. It was a floor plan. A blueprint of some kind. Faded, annotated in handwriting that didn't look like his. "It's from a 1930s train station," he said. "One that was never built." I looked at the lines, the rooms labeled with titles that no longer existed. Telegraph office. Parlor lounge. Women's waiting room. Why show me this? Because I like things that almost happened. The words settled between us, thick and slow. "I keep thinking," he added, "how many lives were imagined in places that never came to be. Meetings. Delays. Goodbyes. Entire chapters that never opened." I turned to him. "And us?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. The way you might approach something fragile, or precious, or both. We kissed. We kissed. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't clumsy. It was measured. Quiet. Like picking up a note in a song and holding it just long enough to feel it resonate in your chest. When we pulled apart, he looked at me, searching. "I'm not trying to take anything," he said. "But I can't pretend nothing's happening." I nodded. "Neither can I." The drive back was even quieter than before. No music this time. Just the low hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of wind slipping through the cracked windows. When we returned to the shop, we didn't go inside. We sat for a few more moments in the car, parked along the curb, our thoughts pacing between us. "I should go," I said. He nodded. "I know." But I didn't move. Not for a minute. Not for 10. Eventually, I opened the door, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and closed it behind me. The sound echoed more than I expected. At home, I changed back into old clothes, folded the navy dress and tucked it under a stack of sweaters. Not hidden. Just buried a little. My husband was in the kitchen again, reading a flyer. "That art exhibit you mentioned, it's opening this weekend. Want to go?" I paused, then smiled. "Sure." He looked genuinely pleased. "We'll make a day of it. Get dinner after." I nodded, even though I didn't know what that day would bring. That night, I stood by the window while brushing my teeth. Outside, the street lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the driveway. I watched them bend and shift, then disappear entirely when the bulb finally gave out. The darkness that followed felt honest. Complete. And strangely, not frightening. There are moments in life when everything becomes painfully still, when even the smallest sounds, ice shifting in a glass, a drawer closing, the creak of the floor under your heel, feel amplified, like the world is holding its breath. That was how the next few days felt. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because too much had happened in the quiet. I went through the motions of daily life as if I were being watched. Not by anyone in particular, but by the reality of my own choices. I cooked, folded clothes, checked emails, answered texts from acquaintances with emojis and half-hearted punctuation. I did all the things that made me look normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. My husband, in his quiet and consistent way, began planning our weekend trip to the exhibit. He circled the day on the calendar in blue ink, leaving a little dot next to it, something he'd always done to mark something just for us. I watched him from across the room as he did it, the gentle bend of his hand, the way he muttered to himself while checking museum hours online. I should have felt love. I should have felt guilt. But all I felt was distance. A vast, echoing space between where I stood and where I used to be. I'd tried to convince myself I could come back. That one more day, one more interaction, wouldn't change anything more than had already changed. But I knew that wasn't true. The antique shop had become more than a place. It was a condition. A state of mind. A version of reality where time didn't quite apply and identity was fluid, more suggestion than certainty. I found myself walking toward it again, without planning to. Like gravity. Or habit. This time, I didn't text ahead. I walked in just as the doorbell chimed its soft, familiar note. He was at the back, bent over a long oak table, brushing dust from the edge of what looked like an old jewelry case. He didn't look up at first, but he didn't have to. I knew he had felt me there. "You came without a reason," he said, his voice low, carrying just enough weight to settle the air between us. "I didn't think I needed one anymore," I replied. He straightened, wiped his hands on a cloth, and motioned toward a small object resting in the middle of the table. It was a brooch. Simple. Silver. Oval. Not unlike the one he'd pinned on me weeks before, but this one was different in its plainness, more real somehow, more grounded. "I found this in a box from the train station estate," he said. "It reminded me of you." I reached for it, turned it in my palm. It was colder than expected, despite the room's warmth. "I'm not sure that's a compliment," I said. He leaned against the table, folding his arms. "It is. It means you're honest. Not trying to be something for someone else." The comment landed deeper than it should have. I had spent years becoming what my life required: caretaker, cook, wife, organizer, placeholder. Somewhere in there, I'd forgotten what I actually was underneath all that. We didn't speak for a while. The light from the front windows began to shift, pulling long amber shadows across the floor. He picked up the brooch, pinned it gently to the edge of my cardigan without asking. His fingers were steady, intentional. I felt the weight of the metal press against my collarbone, cool and quiet. "I have to leave soon," I said, though it wasn't true. He didn't argue. Didn't ask why. Just nodded and stepped back. "Can I see you tomorrow?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to, but because something inside me needed a pause. "I don't know," I answered. "There's a lot I'm not sure of." "That's okay," he said. "I'm not asking for certainty." I left the shop feeling heavier than when I arrived. Not in a painful way, more like something had been added to me, not taken. I walked slowly back to my car, unlocking the door with fingers that trembled more than I wanted to admit. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table long after dinner was done. The dishes were washed, the counters clean, the leftovers tucked neatly away. But I couldn't bring myself to turn off the light or leave the room. My husband found me there, sipping the same cup of tea I'd reheated 3 times. "You're quiet," he said, pulling out the chair beside me. "I'm tired," I replied. "That's all." He nodded, then reached across the table to place his hand over mine. It was a familiar gesture, one he'd done hundreds of times. But tonight, it made my breath catch. "You sure everything's okay?" he asked, voice careful. I looked at him, really looked. The creases near his eyes. The gray in his hair. The worn collar of his favorite shirt. And then I looked away. "I'm just sorting through some things in my head," I said. "That's all." He didn't press. Just gave my hand a gentle squeeze and stood. "Let me know if you want to talk," he added, before walking toward the stairs. I sat there for another hour after he went up. The tea had long gone cold again. The lights in the room began to hum in the silence, that faint electrical buzz only noticeable when the world was quiet. Upstairs, I undressed slowly. The brooch was still pinned to my sweater. I removed it gently, cradling it in my palm before placing it in the drawer beside the bed, next to my reading glasses and a half-finished book I hadn't touched in weeks. I stared at it for a moment before closing the drawer. Not locking it. Just hiding it away, for now. Lying beside my husband that night, I watched the ceiling for signs. Anything to tell me what came next. But there was nothing. Just the sound of his breathing. The warmth of his presence. And somewhere inside me, the awareness that I had started something I could no longer pretend was accidental. Something that was no longer a maybe, no longer abstract. Tomorrow could bring anything. And I didn't know whether that terrified me or thrilled me more. The night before our planned visit to the art exhibit, the house was unusually still. The soft ticking of the wall clock filled the spaces where conversation might have been. I sat alone in the living room, the light from the table lamp casting pools of gold on the carpet. Outside, the wind stirred the branches, making shadows that danced across the curtains. My mind was restless, cycling through memories and what-ifs. I traced the contours of the silver brooch in my fingers, the metal cool and smooth against my skin. It felt heavier than it should have, burdened with all the meaning I was reluctant to acknowledge. I dressed carefully the next morning, choosing a blouse that felt like armor and a skirt that reminded me of better days. My reflection in the mirror was familiar yet strange. The eyes that looked back held a mixture of hope, guilt, and longing. I wondered how much of me was still me, and how much had been altered by the subtle, persistent pull of something forbidden. When my husband joined me for breakfast, he was cheerful and unaware. He told stories about his day ahead, about a colleague's retirement party, about the new restaurant he wanted to try. I smiled and nodded, absorbing his words without really listening. We left the house together, walking to the car side by side. His hand brushed mine briefly as he opened the door, a small gesture loaded with years of habit and affection. I squeezed his hand, a silent promise of presence, though inside I was already elsewhere. The drive to the city was calm, punctuated by familiar landmarks and the gentle hum of the engine. At the museum, the air was cool and tinged with the scent of old stone and varnished wood. People moved quietly around us, their footsteps muffled on the polished floors. The exhibit was a collection of paintings and sculptures from an era long past, pieces that spoke of elegance and restraint. I found myself drawn to a portrait of a woman in a flowing dress, her eyes distant and contemplative. I wondered what stories she held behind that serene expression. We wandered the galleries, sometimes together, sometimes apart, each lost in our own thoughts. My husband pointed out details in the artwork, trying to engage me, but I was distracted. The memory of recent days lingered like a shadow. Later, we found a small cafe nearby. We ordered coffee and shared a slice of tart. The conversation was light, a fragile bridge between what was and what could no longer be. As we walked back to the car, my phone vibrated. A message from him: "I'll be in town for a few more days. Would you like to see something special?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The question was both an invitation and a challenge. I didn't reply immediately. In the quiet of the evening, I sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle against the dark sky. The weight of choices pressed down, but beneath it, a faint pulse of something new, possibility, perhaps, or the ache of rediscovery. Tomorrow would come with decisions. But tonight, I allowed myself the space to breathe, to remember who I was beneath the layers of routine and silence. The morning after the exhibit felt unusually still. Not quiet in the literal sense, there were the same sounds as always, the ticking of the hallway clock, the low clink of the dishwasher finishing its cycle, the distant hum of a leaf blower somewhere down the block. but still in that particular way where everything inside me had paused. I moved through the house with careful steps, as if noise might awaken something fragile. My husband had left early for work. He'd kissed my temple gently, said he might come home late, some client dinner he couldn't get out of. I smiled, nodded, made the appropriate noises of agreement. I stood in the foyer for a long time after he drove away, still holding the edge of the doorframe, my bare feet cold on the tile. The message was still there on my phone, "I'll be in town for a few more days. Would you like to see something special?" I hadn't answered. I wasn't sure if I would. But by noon, I was already choosing a sweater that felt soft and neutral, one that didn't make too strong a statement but didn't disappear either. I did my makeup lightly, with the kind of care that only those who are trying to appear effortless can understand. I told myself I was just going out for errands. Just some air. Just time alone. But I didn't bring a shopping list. I texted him before pulling out of the driveway. Just 3 words. "Where and when?" He replied with a location. A familiar one, just outside the city, near the river. A place I hadn't visited in years. He added, "It's quiet there." "I'll wait." The drive was long and winding, cutting through small towns and stretches of road framed by trees just beginning to change for fall. Their edges were tinged with orange and rust, like the first whisper of change before the wind takes everything down. I kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on my lap, trying to calm the restless motion inside my chest. The spot he'd chosen was a small park by the riverbank. Not the popular part with benches and food carts and joggers. This was a quieter section, near the footbridge, where the grass grew taller and the ground was uneven. He was already there, leaning against the hood of his car, arms crossed, sunglasses pushed into his hair. He didn't wave. Just watched me as I pulled up, his face unreadable. I stepped out, the wind catching the hem of my coat. We didn't speak for a moment. Just stood there, the river murmuring in the background, the sky pale and wide above us. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said finally. "I wasn't sure either," I replied. He nodded slowly, then turned and opened the back of his car. Inside was a small wooden crate, a blanket folded on top of it, and what looked like a set of sketchbooks. He pulled one out and handed it to me. "They belonged to a woman who lived here decades ago," he said. "She sketched the same spot from the same place every year. You can see the trees change. The river widen. It's like time, captured by habit." I flipped through the pages. Each sketch was rough, done in charcoal and faded pencil. The angles were always slightly different, but the same tree was always visible, leaning into the water like it was reaching for something just out of frame. "She never signed her name," he added. "But someone kept them. And now they're here." I sat down on the grass without thinking, smoothing the blanket beneath me. He joined me a moment later, sitting close but not touching. We looked out at the river in silence. The sky above was stretched thin with clouds, but no rain came. "What is it you see when you look at this place?" I asked. He thought for a long time before answering. "Stillness," he said. "But not emptiness. The kind of stillness that lets you hear what's been pushed aside." I nodded. I knew exactly what he meant. We stayed there longer than I intended. Talking quietly, about things we didn't usually say out loud. Not about us, exactly, but about the pieces of life that didn't always have room in ordinary conversation. He told me about moving as a child, about never feeling entirely rooted. I told him about my mother's perfume, how the scent of lilac sometimes made me cry without knowing why. The air cooled as the sun shifted. He took off his jacket and offered it to me, and I accepted without hesitation. It smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee. I pulled it close and let it warm the inside of my arms. Eventually, the quiet between us grew longer. Not strained, just full. He reached out then, gently brushing a loose hair away from my face. The gesture was simple, but my breath caught anyway. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said, barely above a whisper. "You're not," I said. Things were already hard. I just wasn't paying attention. He lowered his hand but didn't look away. "Then why do you keep coming?" I looked out at the water, where the light rippled like brushed silver. "Because something in me woke up," I said. "And I don't know what to do with it yet." We didn't touch again. Didn't kiss. Didn't say anything more for a while. But in that silence, something solidified, an unspoken understanding that what was between us was real, but also heavy, and not without consequence. When I stood to leave, I returned his jacket, folded it with care, and placed it back in the crate. I didn't say goodbye. Just nodded once, and he did the same. The drive home was long, but my thoughts were louder now. Sharper. At home, I made dinner even though I wasn't hungry. I lit candles on the table, not for romance but for the ritual of normalcy. When my husband came in, he looked surprised. "This looks beautiful," he said. "Just felt like making something," I replied. We ate quietly. He told me about his day. I listened. I told him I'd gone for a long drive. He asked if it helped. I said it did. And then, as we cleared the dishes, he wrapped his arms around my waist and kissed the side of my head. "I've missed this," he said. I leaned into him, feeling the truth of his words and the weight of my silence. Later that night, when we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling again. But this time, I wasn't looking for answers. I was bracing for what would come next. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains in fine slats, casting lines across the bed that felt like quiet reminders, boundaries I had crossed, and ones I hadn't yet defined. I lay still for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me. There was something tender about his sleep. The way his hand occasionally twitched. The way his brow stayed relaxed in a way it never did when he was awake. For a moment, I wondered what he dreamed about. Whether I featured in those dreams. Whether I had ever stopped. When he stirred, I closed my eyes briefly, pretending I, too, was just waking up. He kissed my forehead before getting out of bed, heading down the hall to make coffee. I listened to the familiar sounds of our morning routine, the whir of the grinder, the hum of the kettle, the clink of mugs. My body moved on instinct, pulling on a robe, brushing my hair, washing my face. But none of it anchored me. I was already somewhere else. By the time I walked into the kitchen, the table was set. He'd even cut up fruit, something he rarely did unless we had company. He smiled when he saw me. "You slept deeply," he said. "I think I needed it," I replied, pouring myself a cup. He nodded and sat down. We talked, but the words stayed on the surface of weather, errands, news from a neighbor about their roof repairs. He didn't ask where I'd gone yesterday, or why I'd returned so quiet. And I didn't offer. That was how we worked, sometimes. A kind of agreement built not on dishonesty, but on omission. On the silent understanding that asking might mean wanting an answer. When he left for the day, I stayed behind longer than usual. I moved from room to room, dusting places that hadn't been touched in weeks, folding linens that didn't need folding, opening and closing drawers out of habit. Eventually, I ended up in the guest bedroom, the one we barely used, except when relatives visited once or twice a year. I stood at the window and looked out at the backyard, at the fading flowers and the birdbath that hadn't been cleaned in months. And then I saw it. A box. Not large. Tucked beneath the hedge, slightly off-center. As though it had been hidden and forgotten. I opened the back door and stepped out, barefoot against the cold flagstones, crossing the lawn quickly. When I reached the box and opened the lid, I found a bundle of papers inside, old, yellowed receipts, notes in my husband's handwriting, a photograph of us from years ago, folded and creased in the corners. It wasn't suspicious. Nothing alarming. But something about it, its placement, the way it had been stashed, unsettled me. I carried it back into the house and set it on the kitchen counter, unsure what to do with it. I didn't ask him about it later. Didn't mention it. Just put everything back in the box, closed the lid, and placed it in the garage where it wouldn't look like it had been disturbed. That evening, I cooked again. Something simple, but comforting. We ate together, and he told me about a colleague's mishap with a copier, laughing in that familiar, quiet way of his. I listened, but my mind was already adrift, replaying the message I'd received that afternoon. He'd written, "Leaving soon. If I don't see you again before I go, I hope you know I meant all of it." I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. Instead, I went upstairs and opened my drawer, the one where I had placed the silver brooch. I held it in my palm for a long time. It was smooth and cool, a silent witness to everything I hadn't said, everything I had done. I thought about taking it back to him. About returning it, the way you return a borrowed book after too many renewals. But I knew I wouldn't. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, I watched the ceiling again. Not searching for signs. Not even thinking. Just watching. I could feel the warmth of his body beside me, the rhythm of his breath, the rise and fall of the blankets. He shifted in his sleep and rested his hand on mine without waking. I let it stay there. But I didn't close my eyes. Because somewhere in the distance, not far, but just enough, I felt the presence of something final approaching. Something quiet, but irreversible. Like the last page of a letter written too late to be sent. Like the space between two people who still share a bed, but no longer share the same dream. And I knew. Whatever came next, it would change everything. On the morning that everything changed, I woke before dawn, my mind already awake before my body could catch up. I lay still, the house around me breathing in its sleep, unaware of what the day would bring. For a while, I watched the slow bloom of light along the ceiling, the gentle pulse of sunrise against the blinds. My husband slept on, his breathing steady, unaware of my restlessness, the questions winding through my chest. I got up quietly, pulling on an old sweater and slipping out into the hallway. I didn't make coffee, didn't turn on any lights. I moved through the rooms like a visitor, my fingers brushing the backs of chairs, pausing on picture frames filled with moments from years I could barely remember. There was a tightness in my chest that no amount of slow breathing could release. The box in the garage pulled at my thoughts. I found myself standing over it again, tracing its corners, running my thumb along the lid. I didn't open it. There was nothing left inside that I needed to see. I already knew what it contained, a record of all that had been shared and forgotten, a monument to lives that once overlapped more easily. My phone vibrated on the kitchen table, the screen lighting up with his name. My heart raced, but I didn't answer. I watched it until the ringing stopped. Another message appeared. "Leaving today. I wish you well. Take care of yourself." I stood there a long time, reading and rereading his words. I wanted to respond, but everything that came to mind felt inadequate, too small for what we'd shared, too grand for the life I was returning to. In the end, I said nothing. My husband woke and found me at the window, watching the morning come in, pale and uncertain. "Everything all right?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. I nodded. "Just up early. Couldn't rest." He moved behind me, rested his hands on my shoulders, gentle and warm. I leaned back into his touch, not out of habit, but out of memory, a memory of what we once were, what we still could be if I let go of all that weighed between us. He brewed coffee for us, humming softly. The small, ordinary sounds of our life together filled the kitchen, the scrape of the spoon, the tap of the mug on the counter, the distant whistle of the kettle. For a moment, it felt like enough. After breakfast, he suggested we go for a walk. We strolled through the neighborhood, quiet and familiar, the world just beginning to stir. We passed neighbors tending gardens, a child riding his bike in slow, careful circles. My husband talked about plans for the weekend, about painting the guest room, about maybe finally visiting that lake we'd always meant to see. I listened, nodding, letting his voice fill the spaces inside me that had gone hollow. When we returned, I gathered the laundry, sorted and folded it methodically, trying to bring order to the day. I found the silver brooch in the pocket of my skirt, still cold and unyielding. I held it a moment, then placed it in a small dish on my dresser, unsure if I would ever wear it again. The day passed slowly. I kept myself busy, dusting shelves, watering plants, refilling birdseed in the feeder out back. I found comfort in the repetition of these small acts, as if by keeping my hands moving I could keep my mind still. Late in the afternoon, my husband came into the room, his face drawn with quiet concern. "I've noticed you've been distant lately," he said, sitting beside me on the couch. I didn't answer right away. The weight of my silence settled between us, heavy and familiar. "I know things haven't been easy," he continued, his voice gentle. "If there's something you need to tell me, you can." I looked at him, really looked. At the kindness in his eyes, at the lines etched by years of laughter and worry. I saw the man I had built a life with, the man who had always tried to make space for me, even when I couldn't make space for myself. I wanted to tell him everything. To confess, to explain, to lay out the tangled map of my heart and ask him to help me find my way back. But the words caught in my throat, tangled and unspeakable. Instead, I said, "I'm just tired. I'm trying to find my way. I promise I'm not going anywhere." He nodded, taking my hand in his. "I love you, you know." I squeezed his hand. "I love you, too." That evening, I made dinner, setting the table with care. We ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes after many years. Later, as we cleared the plates, he reached for my hand again, holding it for a moment longer than usual. When the house was quiet and the day had faded, I sat alone in the living room, the silver brooch resting in my palm. I turned it over, feeling the weight of all that had happened, all that I couldn't say. Outside, the world moved on. Cars passed in the street, a dog barked somewhere down the block, the last of the sun melted into the horizon. I breathed in, slowly and deliberately, and let myself be still. I didn't know what would happen tomorrow. I only knew that something inside me had shifted, subtle but irrevocable. I was changed, marked not by what I had lost or gained, but by what I had chosen to carry. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like a kind of peace.